So I'm going to start recording this session now. Um, I just wanted to start off by welcoming you and again to encourage you to write to me, text me, or call me whenever you have questions. Several of you have already done that, and it's always great to hear from you. Um, I also wanted to just make sure that everybody is kind of clear on where they need to be at this point. Um, so the main thing at this point is that you should have completed all of those questionnaires and surveys that were part of our first module. That's all the stuff in your textbook in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. It's also the job burnout survey. It's the Big Five personality survey, the Type A personality survey. And you should have watched the videos so you'll know how to interpret those. And remember that you're going to be writing about every single one of those in the skills analysis paper, which is due a few weeks from now. And so one thing I want to encourage you to do is, if you haven't done this yet, go and look at the skills analysis assignment and look at some of the sample papers there, so you have a bit of a feel for what that paper looks like. It's not going to write itself in a night. It's the kind of thing that you probably need to work on a little bit at a time over the next few weeks to make sure everybody's up to speed on that. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. But I just want to make sure everybody's up to speed at this point, and you're all in a good place. So let me pause before we get started and say, if you have questions of me at any point through this, you can unmute yourself and just speak to me anytime you want, or you can simply type in the text box, and that's another way to get to me. So I encourage you to do that. Okay. Any questions before we get started? Okay. Well, let me get going here. I list these sessions as being from 6:30 to 8, but my goal is to never to go over an hour. I think it's really hard to do it more than an hour of these kinds of things, and a lot of times I'll shoot for 45 minutes if I can manage to make that work. I'll always record them and then post them on Canvas sometime the next day. Generally, it takes about 45 minutes or an hour, literally, to convert the recording to an MP4 file, and then at that point I can upload it to YouTube and get it posted. So I usually can't post it until the next day. The reason why I wanted to do this particular session is this chapter on managing personal stress is one that consistently gets a lot of interest from students, because graduate students are generally busy, really busy, and have busy lives, busy work lives, and are students, and hence often experience a lot of stress. It's also a topic that has a lot of applications outside of the workplace. So I think it's really worth talking about in that regard. And I don't want to go through all the main material in the chapter at all. That's not my goal. Instead, what I'd like to do is highlight maybe just 5 or 6 key points that are the key takeaways that I hope you'll walk away from the course with about managing personal stress. So that's my goal, and jump in if you have any questions here. So yeah, go ahead.
Professor, I think I was on mute before, but so the surveys and everything, there wasn't really anything we needed to submit. It's just that we need to take them and keep up, like, I guess, and learn how to score them and reach out to if we have questions scoring them for the other piece.
That's exactly right. You don't need to submit anything now, but all of those surveys will need to be written about and interpreted in terms of their meaning to you when you write that skills analysis paper several weeks from now. So the idea is to get that stuff done now so you can start to work on that skills analysis paper gradually and start to work on those pieces of the skills analysis paper now, even though that it's a fairly long paper, won't be due for a few more weeks. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay. So I heard a psychologist say this, and I thought it was a great point. they said that some individuals are naturally at peace and content. And there was a psychologist who studied such individuals. This is what that psychologist learned. If you can sit quietly after difficult news, if in a financial downturn you remain perfectly calm, if you can see your neighbors travel to fantastic places without being jealous, if you can happily eat whatever is put on your plate and fall asleep after a day of running around without a drink or a pill, and you can always find contentment just where you are, chances are you're a dog. The bottom line is that people can't do those things very well. We are not like our dogs. And for those of you who have dogs, you know that they seem to have amazing abilities to be content in difficult circumstances. But we're not like that. And we need to talk about why. So one of the major points that I always start with, and I'm only going to spend just a couple minutes on this because it's in a short video that is posted for this week. So very, very short amount of time here, is making sure that people are thinking about the biology of stress. When a lot of people talk about stress, they talk about it as though it's a psychological phenomenon. It's something that's in your head. But stress is always both psychological and biological. There's always a psychological and a physiological component to stress. And of course, that's because of what people have for decades referred to as the fight or flight response. So you've got a zebra being attacked by a lion. The zebra needs to get the hell out of there. The hungry lion needs to run down its prey. And both have an activated stress response, what's called a flight or a fight response. That's a very adaptive response for them. Very adaptive. Unfortunately for us, we can activate very similar biological stress responses due to short-term psychological stress or to chronic psychological stress when there's no physical threat at all. So although that stress response, that fight or flight response, might have been adaptive for the lion or the zebra, especially when we experience chronic stress, it is not adaptive for us. And again, I won't go into a lot of details here, but a reminder that this stress response involves both our autonomic nervous system. There are two parts to that, as you probably remember from high school biology: our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is involved in our stress response, and it also involves hormones, which are blood-borne and move in between cells in different parts of the body. And the main hormones that are involved in our stress response are adrenaline, which is also called epinephrine, and a number of glucocorticoids. The cortisol being the most well-known of those, right? And all different parts of our brain are involved in this. Our brainstem and hypothalamus, which are the oldest parts in terms of evolutionary history of our brain. Hypothalamus is very important in the stress response. The limbic system, which actually isn't a location, it's a set of different parts of the brain that work together and that play a really important role in emotions. And our cortex, which is the very outer thin layer of our brain, but the most recently evolved in the part that makes us really stand out from any other animals. All three of those, as we'll see, are involved in this biological stress response, right? And when we have this stress response, a whole bunch of stuff happens. Again, I won't go through all these details, but the bottom line is, ultimately, our hypothalamus communicates with our pituitary gland, which communicates with our adrenal glands, which sit on top of our kidneys, and those send out other stress hormones, and our liver begins to release glucose, sugar, into our bloodstream to give us energy. Right? And that's a really adaptive thing, because if there's a real fight or flight, you need a lot of energy. Right? Right? And so things happen. Our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, our breathing rate increases. All of this is good because it accelerates our ability to deliver nutrients like oxygen and glucose to different parts of the body. And other things happen in our body. Our perception of pain is blunted. Our body gets better at clotting wounds. We become more alert. But other bad things happen. Our blood is diverted away from parts of our body that don't need it at that moment, like our gut, our reproductive organs. the blood vessels in our digestive tract actually constrict. Longer term issues are become diminished or ignored by the body. Growth, tissue repair, reproduction, digestion, they're all inhibited. So whenever we're stressed, all these things are happening to us simultaneously. And we're not necessarily aware of them. We're just aware of feeling stressed. But they play a really pivotal role here. And again, the major piece of this role is what's called the HPA axis, our hypothalamus, our pituitary gland, and our adrenal glands. And again, just reminding you, all these things are at play. You will never feel stressed without having this happen to you. One of the big problems with all of this is when this biological stress response is triggered again and again, or if it kind of sits there over a long period of time, one of its best known effects is to diminish the effectiveness of our immune system. And it is that reason why, when we're feeling stressed, we become much more susceptible to a wide range of diseases. We're not arguing that stress causes all of those diseases, but by damaging the immune system, it makes us much more susceptible to those diseases and illnesses, even something as simple as a common cold, which you might be able to tell by listening to my voice, I actually have right now. So just want you to keep those things in mind. And I'm going to, that's enough about the biology, but I just want to emphasize that point. Now let me talk a little bit about the psychology of stress. This is one of the biggest takeaways I hope that you'll have from this particular topic. It's something that I think the book does not emphasize enough. I like our textbook very much on its chapter on managing stress. It's a very good one, but I don't think it emphasizes this enough. Almost all clinical psychologists will tell you this. I am an industrial and organizational psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. Clinical psychologists are the types who do therapy. I might need therapy, but I don't do therapy. But it's not events that cause stress. It's what we think of those events. Stated differently, our cognitions, the way we are thinking about events, the way we are interpreting what is happening to us, play a pivotal role in all stress responses. This is one reason why some people experience the exact same situation as others, but some of them don't feel stress, where others feel a large amount of stress. It's not due to differences in the situation they're facing. It's due to differences in the way they interpret or think about those situations. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. So let me talk briefly about acute versus chronic stress. So you know acute stress generally. You know, if you're ever in a car accident, you know what acute stress feels like. I was in a car accident about 15 months ago in a snowstorm, and I was in my lane driving very slowly on a country road, and a guy coming at me lost control of his car. It spun around, faced the other way, crossed into my lane, and slammed head on into me. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, although my car was totaled. But the moment something like that happens to you, you have an immediate stress reaction. And we all experience this kind of thing, this very acute kind of stress. But chronic stress is even more damaging to many humans because most animals don't experience chronic stress. It's stress that's kind of always sitting in the background, but humans experience it a lot. There are a lot of reasons why we do that. One is that for humans, we tend to live in a world that's very different from the world in which our brains evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago. So many things that cause us chronic stress day in and day out are relatively recent developments historically. Whether you're worried about your investments in the market or the constant noise from your neighbor or the computer problems you're having or the damn traffic jam in the morning or the long line at the grocery store or whatever, these are things that our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago didn't face, but we do. And they happen to us day in and day out. We also live in an environment where we invest a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of effort into things, but we don't know for quite a bit of time after that whether or not we're going to get any payoff from it. That's very true of our jobs and many other things. Prior to the development of agriculture, that was not true. So we live in a world where we don't find out whether the hunt was successful, whether our efforts were successful for a long period of time, and therefore we worry. And we face many problems that we simply can't solve. They're simply out of our control. All of those things lead us to experience chronic stress. And that chronic stress is accompanied by those physiological processes that I just described. So these are the most common causes of chronic stress. Hard to avoid. Money. It turns out, by the way, that almost no matter how much money you make, people worry about money. Some much more than others, but people worry about money. Relationships, work, school, health, or maybe a family member's health, or just the daily hassles and irritants of being alive. All sources of chronic stress, all wearing us down, all causing this stress response to happen, all leading to the release of cortisol and epinephrine into our systems, all ultimately damaging our immune systems. Lots of studies have indicated that the majority of visits to family practice doctors and internal medicine doctors are due to something that's either caused by or made worse by stress. That's how powerful this is. And so learning to be able to manage this stress is an incredibly important skill, not just to have a good life, but also to be an effective manager. And if you can't do that, if you've ever worked for somebody who's constantly stressed out, it's extremely difficult. And it's as if they're contagious. They pass that stress on to other people. And you don't want to be that boss. There are a lot of other downsides to stress that are cognitive. All the research shows that when we are feeling stressed, we only tend to pay attention to information that confirms what we already expected. We get fixated on only a single way to approach a problem. We tend to have a short-term crisis mentality. We don't think about the long-term implications of our behavior. We tend to listen to and consult less with others. We rely on old habits and are not very creative. All of those things are damaging to us, and all of those are direct results of stress, cognitive downstream consequences of stress. Okay? So here's the model that our book uses. And this is a really nice model, and it's a good way to explain thinking about stress if you've never thought about it before. So the first thing on the left-hand side is we need to talk about what's a stressor. And I don't know how many of you have heard that phrase before, but a stressor is something that might cause stress. I'm not guaranteeing it's going to cause stress, but it might cause stress. That's possible. I'll talk about different kinds of stressors in a moment, but a stressor is not itself stress. It's something that might cause us stress. And it's interesting to note that a number of stressors are things that we think of as being positive. If you've ever bought a home, buying a home is a stressor. That is, many of us experience the event of buying a home and that series of events over months as being very stressful. Not all of us, but some. Another great example is getting married. An event that should be hopefully very happy. But for those of you who've gone through it, as I have, and one of my kids just went through it, and another one of my kids is going through it in 2 months, boy, getting married can be really stressful. So it's not just negative things that are stressors, but they're things that are out there and that might lead us to feel stressed. Will we have that physiological and psychological stress reaction? That depends. It depends on how resilient we are. Do we have the cognitive resiliency to think about the event in a way that will diminish its impact on us? Do we have social support? And have we developed the kind of physical conditioning that allows us to be resilient to stress? That's the basic thing. That's the basic model. And it's a nice way to think about it because, again, those physiological and psychological reactions are not automatically following those stressors. They will for some of us, but they won't for others. And learning about how to build that resiliency, that's the powerful thing. the big thing about managing stress is not figuring out how to cope with it in the moment that it happens, because by then it's often too late. The big thing about managing stress is learning how to become resilient so that when it does happen, its effects are minimized. So I want to talk briefly about burnout. There's a burnout survey that's something you were asked to complete and score. And I just want to put burnout in a particular context for you. You can think of burnout as something that exists on a continuum. At one end of the continuum, people are burned out at work. At the other end of the continuum, they're really engaged and involved with their job and energized by their job. Don't think of those as two separate things. Think of them as a continuum. Some of us are emotionally exhausted by what we face at work, but others are energized by what we face at work. We're excited. We literally have energy when we do our jobs. Some of us become very cynical by what we experience at work, but others, we become very involved. Some of us have a sense of inefficacy, which is a sense that we're working hard. I'm killing myself here, but things aren't getting any better. But on the other end of that continuum, some people feel a sense of efficacy. They go into work feeling like, you know what, I matter. What I do matters. This is good. And so think of burnout as the opposite of engagement. And so when you're thinking about where you stand and when you're looking at your burnout scores on the burnout survey, think about how you might be able to take some steps to move from that burnout side of the continuum to the engagement side of the continuum. And your survey, your job burnout survey gives you 3 scores. A score for how exhausted you feel emotionally. Do you feel overextended? Do you feel beyond your emotional and physical resources? Do you feel cynical, callous, detached? I don't give a damn anymore. That kind of an attitude? Do you feel that sense of inefficacy, a sense of reduced accomplishment? You're just not getting things done. You're feeling like you're not being productive. You're not achieving what you want to achieve. And where are you with relative to others? So that's one way to think about burnout. And again, burnout has a whole set of consequences that are very similar to those we see with any other kind of stress response. You know, tension, hypertension, high blood pressure, cold, flu, can't sleep, stomach problems, headaches, etc. Classic correlates of burnout. The one thing I want to explain about burnout, and I want to emphasize this, is burnout is not a quality that you walk around with. That is to say, you might be burned out at some times of the year, but not burned out at other times of the year. It's not a personality characteristic that you have. It is affected not only by how you think about your work, but by the events that you experience at work. And if you're like me, this typically happens to me. I go through phases at work where I am feeling pretty burned out, but then a couple months later, I'm not feeling any burnout at all. In that sense, it's something very different from those personality scores that you've been completing on many of these other instruments. Those things tend to be much more stable over time. Of course, when we're burned out, we tend to be less satisfied with our job, less committed to the organization. We tend to be absent more often. We want to get the heck out of this job. We are more likely to quit. There's lower levels of patient care among healthcare providers. Police actually increase the level of violence against civilians when they're feeling burned out. And one of the biggest problems with burnout for us is it affects our families. We bring it home. There's a spillover effect. So let's talk about how to cope with all this, right? There are 3 basic approaches to managing stress. One is, of course, to try to just eliminate stressors, to try to set up your life so that you don't experience many stressors. And I always say, good luck with that. There are some things you can do to eliminate some stressors. That certainly happened in my life. I once switched jobs, and just switching jobs eliminated a whole bunch of stressors from my life. But there's no way you're going to eliminate all the stressors you face in your life. Just not feasible. So the more realistic approach is to develop resiliency. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. When you're feeling very stressed out, you can learn some short-term coping mechanisms, but that is, again, not the optimal thing to do to manage stress. I'm not arguing it's bad, but you're much better off focusing your efforts on becoming resilient to stress. And so that's what we'll talk about next. Again, it's not events that cause stress, it's what people think of events that cause stress. So an event is a stressor, but it's how we interpret the event that causes stress. I will give you a really quick, simple example of this. When I first started working at LaSalle, which was over 2 decades ago, I had a very long commute. I lived in Somerset County, New Jersey. And in fact, I still live in Somerset County, New Jersey. And my commute to this day, if there's no traffic, if everything's moving well, I can get from home to here in an hour and a half. And an hour and a half back home. That's 3 hours in the car on a given day. If I leave at a bad time in the afternoon, which in Philly is any time after 3:30 to about 7, it's almost 2 hours to go each way. And I used to be really stressed out about that. I was always trying to find shortcuts to get here, to cut off 10 minutes, 15 minutes, make that commute less in time. And the first several months I was here, I was getting advice from people about different ways to get here. For those of you who are from Philly, everybody has a favorite theory, if you're from Philly, about how to drive through Philly and to avoid the worst parts of Philly to get here. I found that none of those worked. I tried timing myself day in and day out. Nothing was working. I was constantly stressed when I was in the car. And finally, I remembered my own advice. And I said, it can't be the drive that's causing me to feel stress. It's got to be something about the way I'm thinking about that drive. And I'm thinking about the drive as though it's wasted time. This is just a waste of time, me being in the car. It occurred to me, finally, that it's not necessarily a waste of time. That at the time, my kids were very young. At the time, my kids were about, I think they were maybe 2 and 5 years old. And I had no private time at all. The instant I would walk into the house, of course, after work, the kids want to play with you. And my wife, who'd been home with the kids all day long, wanted me to take the kids. That's pretty natural. And I always felt like I couldn't do anything I wanted to do. You know, whenever we watch TV, we were watching, The Lion King for the 500th time or something, you know. And we were always listening to Disney music and all that kind of stuff. And I just felt like I had no private time. It finally occurred to me, I have 3 hours of private time every day. It's when I'm in the car. It's actually not wasted time. It's potentially private time if I can figure out how to use it well. So I started listening to books on tape, but are actually, of course, books on CDs or electronic files now. I started building up my collection of music that I could listen to in the car, classical, jazz, rock, etc., lots of different things I like. I purchased online courses you could take to learn about all kinds of stuff, from physics to biology to history and on and on and on. And I would listen to all this stuff in the car, and it was very relaxing. And now when I get into the car, I look forward to it because I have all this stuff I'm going to do. Tonight I'm going to drive home. I'm going to listen to a lecture about some classical music that I'm trying to learn more about. I don't know much about it, but I'm trying to learn more about it. And I'm going to wind up listening to a lecture when I drive home tonight about a cello concerto that was written by Dvorak. Oddly enough, I'm kind of looking forward to that. Suddenly, the stressor, the car ride, an hour and a half each way, right, isn't causing me stress at all because I'm thinking about it differently. And this happens in many, many instances in my life. I've learned this skill, and that's the big skill for you to learn as well. If you're interested in reading some books about how to do that, shoot me an email, and I've got several suggestions of some really nice books that can be very helpful. Okay, what other kinds of stressors are there? There's time stressors. We all know that sense of having too much to do and not enough time to do it in. Right? There's encounter stressors. These are the interpersonal conflicts we run into, family, coworkers, etc. There's situational stressors. You're working in an environment where things are changing really rapidly, or you're just working in a lousy work environment. And finally, there's one that humans have, but animals don't. And I'll bet you for you, it's one of the bigger ones. It has been for me. That's called anticipatory stressors. We're thinking about what might go wrong. I don't know if any of you do that, but it's really common, really common. So we worry. Nothing has even happened. We're just worrying that something might happen. And because we're worrying that something might happen, we experience stress, just as if it had happened. Those are all different kinds of stressors, and we can find different ways to cope with them. And the textbook is really good about offering some advice. But I want to focus on just a few key pieces of advice here, okay? So the first one I want to focus on is some time management stuff. That's my favorite cartoon on time management. Raise your hand if you've, before reading this book, a textbook, or looking at this slide, how many of you had seen a slide just like this someplace beforehand? So only one person. Now, I first saw this, Dante, I don't know where you saw it, but the first time I saw it was in a book that became very famous years ago. It was called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's not a bad book, but it's a very influential way of thinking about managing time. And so I just want to describe it to you because I think getting this is a major takeaway. We can think of almost everything we experience, various activities we might have to complete, various tasks we have to complete, in terms of how important they are and how urgent they are. Well, we can think of some tasks as being both very important and very urgent. And of course, those happen, right? Crises or a customer standing in front of you complaining. Yeah, that's important and it's urgent. Got to deal with it right away. Of course, sometimes somebody else will tell us that something is both important and urgent, but we have to be smart enough to think to ourselves, is it really? Is it really? If you let other people always dictate to you what's important and what's urgent, you will lose control of your ability to manage time well. So you need to think about that carefully. We'll also think about some things that are neither urgent nor are they important, but we do them anyways. These are the kinds of things I've seen any number of people who do this, sit at work and they stop for 15 minutes and they play a video game. Not urgent, not important, but they do it anyways. There are some things that are demanding our attention, but they're really not that important. Got a new email. Phone's ringing. Somebody just walked up to my door and started talking to me. Those seem to be urgent because they seem to be demanding our attention, although they might not be important at all, actually. Right? And then there are some things, and this is a really pivotal quality to think about, that are very important, but they're not especially urgent. These are the kinds of things like what you're doing now, which is going to classes, getting a degree, learning more, advancing your education, working on a project that nobody is currently asking for, but you think it would be a good thing to do. So you set aside some time to work on it, day in and day out. Not a lot, but a little bit. Each week, you nibble away at it. You get a little bit more done. Not urgent, but boy, if you could get it done, it'd be really important. And I'll tell you one thing I found over and over in my life. People who are successful in both their personal lives and in their work lives are different from others in one really important way. And that's that they spend more time working on things that are important but not urgent. People who are less successful don't tend to spend a lot of time working on something unless there's some sense of urgency about it. People who are successful seem to have the ability to day in and day out, or at least week in and week out, set aside time to work on things that are potentially very important and will be really advantageous in the long run, but there's no immediate urgency for them. And hence I want to argue that the key to effective time management is not finding more time. It's not being more efficient. The key to effective time management is allocating more of your time to work on things that are potentially very important, but that are not urgent. And finding little slices of time to do that and committing to do those first, before you're doing something else. And that's a time management skill. This idea that I'm going to be good at time management if I just become more efficient and I'll just do more stuff. It just means you wind up doing stuff in the same quadrants you're already doing stuff in. The trick in effective time management is shifting some of your time to work on that quadrant 3. Not urgent, but important. So that's one thing I want you to be thinking about. That's one big takeaway here in terms of managing personal stress. Okay. Resiliency. I am not proud to say that I'm the person who drew what you're looking at here. You can imagine why I'm not proud to say it, because it's a really badly drawn picture. Shows you how little skill I have at graphics and art. But it will suffice to make our point here. I'd like you to think about your life as it exists now, and think about all the aspects of your life, not just your work life. And I want you to think about how much time do you spend, for example, on each one of these slices. How much time on family activities? How much on social activities, intellectual activities, work, cultural activities, physical exercise, spiritual activities? You might even print out a slide like this and kind of shade it so that if you spend plenty of time in that slice, you'd shade it quite fully, kind of color it in. But if you don't, maybe it wouldn't be very filled up at all. So here's a big takeaway here. The more of these things you spend time in, the more your life activities are balanced across all of these categories, the more resilient you are to stress. People who are not resilient to stress often devote a very large proportion of their time to only one of these categories. For many people, it's work. Huge amounts of time at work, very little time devoted to anything else. For some people, it's family. But whatever it is, that lack of balance across a variety of different activities makes you less resilient to stress. People who experience stressors, difficult times, when their life is spread across both being physically active, having some spiritual sense. I don't mean that to be religion in particular, although it could be. I certainly don't mean it to refer to any particular religion. They're involved with family and friends. They're growing intellectually. They're engaged in meaningful work, and they participate in some kind of cultural activities. Those kinds of people are just more resilient to stress. No one event knocks them off balance that much. So this is another example where it's not a matter of becoming more efficient with your time. It's saying, looking at something like this and saying, where do I need to be spending time that I'm not spending time right now? Again, this is a reallocation of where you're spending your time. So very much like that time management grid we were just looking at before. Okay. Type A personality, you're going to take that and you can look at my brief video on that, which is in our week 1 module. But I just want to remind you that people who have a type A personality create their own stress. That is to say, you don't need anything to be stressful. You'll just create your own stress because you're impatient or you're highly competitive, excessively competitive. I mean, being competitive, it can be a good thing. Excessively competitive, not good. You're way over involved in work. Or the worst case scenario, you have a lot of hostility and anger. Now, if you have a score of 12 or above on the type A inventory on any one of those 4 skills, that indicates a type A tendency. The higher your score, the more type A. But the key thing about type A personality is you're creating your own stress. And type A personalities are related to a whole host of health problems. Anxiety, they affect our relationships, heart disease. The biggest risk factor in terms of heart disease and heart attacks, by the way, is having a high score on that hostility and anger dimension. So pay attention to that. Type A people often incorrectly attribute their success to the fact that they're very type A. But it's generally not the case. People who are highly competitive, their score might be 16, 17, 18 on the competition scale, are generally no more successful than people who are moderately competitive. Scores 10, 11, 12, 13. But they are more stressed. So type A behavior is something you can change. And I used to be much more type A than I am now, much more. I'm still a little bit high on the impatience scale, but I've gotten way better. Okay, I won't talk about how to exercise what we call mindfulness, but I just want to mention again, some of you probably know this, but boy, mindfulness is one of those things where it doesn't take much time to learn basic mindfulness techniques. It doesn't. But if you learn them, it only takes about 10 minutes a day. And this is a simple guide to how to do it. You can find tons of stuff online. Just Google it with audios and videos about how to do it. It's very simple, doesn't take a lot of time, and there's a huge amount of research suggesting its positive effect in many, many aspects of our life. Okay. So our working memory becomes better, our attention becomes better, we're less distracted by kind of thoughts that pop in and out of our mind. We become more effective at a whole range of cognitive tasks. And in the end, we simply are better at managing our stress. It's a very simple technique to learn, and so that's another big takeaway. But here's the last takeaway, and we're going to finish with this. This is a story that I first heard a while back called, I always call it the story of rocks in the mason jar. You know what a mason jar looks like. It's like the jar here in this picture. You've seen those. So I heard this story, I don't know, about 15 years ago. I don't even know if the story's true. It might be apocryphal. Either way, it's a great story. And here's the story. It's an Ivy League university. There's a management class, and they're talking about managing time. And a special instructor, a guest instructor, is there for that day to talk about managing time. That guest instructor has a very large box with stuff inside of it. And he takes out a big mason jar like this, a really big one. Takes the top off it. And he reaches into his box, and he starts putting some large rocks into the jar. You can envision kind of large, chunky rocks. Putting them in as best he can. Reaches a point where he can't get any more of those big rocks in there. And he says to the class, do you think I can get any more rocks in there? Is there anything else I can get in the jar? And they say, well, I don't think so. I don't see there's any way you can get anything else in there. So then he reaches into his box, and now he takes out some smaller pebbles. And he starts to put those pebbles in. And those pebbles fall through and all around the bigger rocks, and they start to fill up the jar until the pebbles come up to the rim of the jar. And he says, can I get anything else in here? And the students are laughing, and they say, well, maybe, I don't know. And sure enough, he takes out a bag of very fine-grained sand, and he starts to pour the sand in. And he pours the sand in until it overflows the jar and spills over the edge. And he says, can I get anything else in there? And of course, by this point, everybody's laughing, and because they don't know what's going to happen next. And sure enough, he reaches into his box and he pulls out a jug of water, and he starts pouring water in. And of course, it flows through the sand, and he keeps pouring it in until the water completely overflows the top of the mason jar. And then he says, what's the point? What's the point? What's the lesson to be learned here? And remember, this is about time management. And one of the very smart Ivy League MBA students says, well, I guess kind of the point is that even when you think you can't get anything else done, that you're doing as much as you can possibly do. Your life is as full as it can possibly be. You could do more. And a few other students nod their head, saying, yeah, that sounds good. I guess that's the point. And the guest instructor says, no, here's the point. The point is, you have to put the big rocks in first. I'm going to say that again. You got to put the big rocks in first. As the instructor said, if I'd put the pebbles and the sand and the water in first, I'd never get any big rocks in. In order to get things done, you got to figure out what's the most important stuff, not the most urgent stuff. And you got to get that done first. It's got to go first, not last. It's not something you do after everything else is done. I'll do these interesting, important things that aren't urgent after I get everything else done. When I finally hit a point in my life where I don't have anything to do. That's crazy, because that time will never come in your life until you're dead. So the key is to say to yourself, what are the big things? And if I'm looking at the big things right here, I'm saying the big things are stuff that's important but not urgent. Stuff that looks at that life balance wheel that I showed you and says, where do I need to be spending a bit more time to create more life balance for me personally right now? And how else can I build resilience? Those things could be diet, exercise, whatever it might be. Making social contact, spending time with friends. One of the best ways to reduce stress is to have simply 2 or 3 close friends in life that you can talk to about anything. Those are the things that matter. Those are the big things. They're the big rocks. But they have to happen first. You can't manage your stress by thinking, I'll get everything else done, and then when I finally have time, I'll do those other things. That's not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. So I hope that you think about that, and if you pick managing stress as a skill you want to work on in terms of your contract, which is something that many people wind up doing, I hope you think about that and think a lot about what are those important but not urgent things. What are those life balance things? What are those things that you could be doing to build resilience? It's not becoming more efficient. It's focusing on different activities. So I want to end with that. And I just want to end, those are my main takeaways from the chapter. I know the chapter has dozens of things in it, but I hope that those things will at least kind of leave you with the idea that, those are a couple things that I really want you to remember when this course is over, long after this course is over. And I'll just ask you to end tonight by simply responding to this one poll, just a very quick poll about tonight's short session. We've gone about 50 minutes and we're going to stop. And as I said, that's what I want to do. I never want to go even more than an hour. And so just let me know what you think here by responding, and I'll give everybody a chance to vote. By the way, whenever I do these polls, I can't see what any one person said. I can only see the aggregate data. Okay. Got almost everybody. Just a couple more seconds for getting that last vote. Well, good. That's very, very helpful feedback. And I'm glad that people found the session to be reasonably helpful. That's always useful feedback for me. Again, I'll stop the recording now. I will convert this and it will be posted on Canvas sometime tomorrow in case you ever want to look at it again or check it out again. This week is a lot less crazy than last week in terms of the amount of things you have to do, but you do have homework due at the end of this week. Remember, you do have an assignment on stress management, and so I'll look forward to getting that, and I'll try to get that back to you within a day or two of you guys posting your responses at the end of the week. I hope you all have an enjoyable rest of the week, and I heard the weather's supposed to get up into the 50s, and it's long overdue. I hope you all enjoy it. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.